This is a talk on analytic element groundwater modeling that I presented at MODFLOW and More in June of 2019 at Colorado School of Mines. It's entitled AEM, Stepwise Tool for Analyzing Flow in Fractured Bedrock Aquifers. There are a number of computer modeling tools available for analyzing groundwater flow in fractured bedrock aquifers. In this talk, I want to show you how the analytic element method is especially well suited for doing that in a way that follows a stepwise modeling approach. The examples will include adding anisotropy caused by regional fractures and joint sets, analyzing pumping for wells pumping near or in a fracture or fault, for example, well capture zones and drawdown test results, and analyzing flow pathways in fractured and faulted bedrock aquifers under natural and pumping influenced conditions. We may want to model flow in fractured and faulted bedrock aquifers for a number of different project types, including water supply, where we may want to tap into a fracture zone or fault for higher yield, radioactive waste storage or hazardous waste disposal, where faults or fractures may cause preferential pathways that could allow waste to move away from the disposal site, groundwater remediation, where fractures, joints, and faults can control flow in ways that must be taken into account in the remedial system design, and carbon dioxide sequestration, where vertical fractures or faults may allow the stored CO2 to escape. Stepwise groundwater modeling basically involves starting with a simpler approach or method to scope out the problem, and then applying more refinement or sophistication until you reach a solution that embodies an acceptable level of complexity and confidence. There are two ways that AEM modeling of fractured rock systems fits into a stepwise paradigm. First, because of where it fits on the spectrum of available tools, and two, because of the range of element solutions within the AEM toolkit itself. Let's start with where it fits on the spectrum of tools. There are several modeling tools to simulate flow in fractured and faulted aquifers, including analytic solutions that are simple mathematical flow equations, analytic element models with a variety of flow solutions that can be added together to form a complex flow field, numerical models, for example, finite difference or finite element models that contain a few discrete fractures or faults, and discrete fracture network, or DFN models, which simulate flow through a system of many, often stochastically generated, interconnected fractures. Experience has shown that the analytic element method, in this stepwise application of methods, often provides a sweet spot of easy setup, speed of execution, and simulation power. There have been numerous studies over the years in which analytic element method AEM models have been used to analyze groundwater flow in fractured and faulted groundwater systems. Dr. Otto Strack, Dr. Henk Heichema, and their students developed analytic element solutions for fracture and fault features. For example, Steve Kramer's PhD work in 1990 focused on AEM methods for simulating flow in fracture networks. In 1994, Rob Earl published his consulting work on a groundwater remediation system study in which he used the AEM code SLAM to model the effect of a highly fractured bedrock aquifer zone cutting across the site and how it would affect the planned pump and treat system. Henry He, for a consulting project in 2004, used the AEM model 2DAN to model the flow pathway of contaminated groundwater from a waste source along a fault zone to a discharge point in a nearby stream. Eric Anderson and Mark Bacher in 2008 developed an analytic approach to calculating vertical flow along a leaky fault in response to pumping. And in 2012, Marin and Strack used analytic elements to examine flow near and through rock fractures. On the spectrum of analysis tools, AEM models offer a number of advantages, including allowing the modeler to build on a selected analytic solution, in this case, flow to a well pumping from a fracture, and move beyond that analytic solution to create a more usable model framework that incorporates other hydraulic and hydrologic features for site analyses. Here I am showing an example of a well pumping from a fracture, but I can use this model also to perform path line tracing, and I can add other wells and fractures. Also, with an AEM model, you can represent any fracture or fault geometry and orientation without problems of cutting at some angle across a grid or having to excessively refine the grid, because there is no grid. I also like the fact that an AEM model allows you to examine the flow field on scales from inches, for example near a fracture or fault, to miles in the far field. And you can also use insight gained from the AEM model to develop a more complex numerical model if that is required. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that you can use AEM modeling as one of the steps up in complexity between modeling methods, from analytic to analytic element, then numerical and DFN, if you'd like. In addition, stepwise modeling can also be conducted by stepping up in complexity within the analytic element method toolkit itself. This can include use of anisotropy, fracture or drain type elements, no flow or leaky barrier line elements, a river type element to represent a leaky vertical fault, long, narrow, high permeability heterogeneities to represent transmissive faults, and composite elements that can represent faults or fractures. In the next couple sections, I will show how AEM models can be used to simulate fractured and faulted bedrock aquifers. We will start with the simple case where a system of fractures or intersecting joint sets has created horizontal anisotropy in the flow system. Suppose we want to develop a flow model for an aquifer in which a system of near vertical fractures or joint sets have introduced anisotropy into the hydraulic conductivity properties of the aquifer. We begin with a simple AEM model with isotropic hydraulic conductivity. The hydraulic gradient is from west to east, and because of the isotropic conditions, groundwater flow is to the east. Here is the same model and the same gradient with head declining to the east. But here, the hydraulic conductivity field is set with 3:1 horizontal anisotropy. The major axis of the hydraulic conductivity tensor is oriented 45 degrees to the southeast. You can see from the head contours that hydraulic gradient direction is to the east, but because of the anisotropy, the resulting groundwater flow direction is 27 degrees south of east. This will affect the regional flow direction, orientation of pumping well capture zones in that flow field, and other flow features. In the next several sections, we will examine AEM models that incorporate fault zones into the regional aquifer flow field using a variety of elements and techniques, including barrier faults, where those faults can be either no flow or leaky barriers, transmissive fault, where flow moves into and along the fault zone, pumping from a well in a fracture or fault that is represented as a simple linear AEM element, pumping from a well in a fault zone where that is represented as a transmissive zone of some width, a bounding fault effect on a pumping test where the fault has both a core and a surrounding rock damage zone, vertical inflow from a leaky fault into a lower aquifer flow zone, and a cross-section model, a two-dimensional vertical slice model, that shows how geologic fracture and fault features can affect the vertical movement of groundwater. In this model, we have set up regional aquifer flow from west to east, or left to right, with a pumping well in the eastern area. Upgradient from the pumping well, there are two sealed faults that act as no-flow barriers to flow. You can see how the flow paths are diverted around these faults. As one example, the purple path line shows that flow from an area directly west of the pumping well is diverted far to the north before flowing around the end of the sealed fault zone and then into the well. Without consideration of the fault, you might think that any contamination in this area near the north end of the fault likely came from an area directly west. But with the fault barrier effect, contamination from a zone farther south and west could flow northward to impact this area. This is the same aquifer flow system model, but here the fault elements are changed from no-flow barriers to leaky barriers. You can see from the red path lines that groundwater flow is diverted by the fault zones, but flow from west to east does pass through those fault zones and onto the well. As one example, this purple path line shows that flow from the area due west of the pumping well that flowed far to the north in the previous no-flow barrier model now passes straight through the fault zone and enters the well. In this model, the faults are in the same locations, but they have been replaced by elements that enclose a long, narrow zone of significantly greater hydraulic conductivity than the surrounding bedrock, i.e., a transmissive fault zone. Groundwater flow is diverted by the faults, but this time the flow is moving within the fault zone, as shown by the red path lines. Note that this model is different from the simpler models that only allowed groundwater to be diverted along the fault or leak through the fault, but not to flow within the fault itself. As an example of how this affects the flow field, flow from a source area in the southwestern area of the model is drawn northward along the fault zones and ends up entering the pumping well, while flow from another area west of the well is drawn northward within the transmissive fault to such an extent that it ends up exiting the fault north of the well and flowing past the well without being captured. In this model, we are going to examine the hydraulics of a well pumping from directly within a fracture zone. It is well known that if a well is located to pump water from a transmissive fault zone, the well can produce greater yield with less drawdown than a well located somewhere in the body of the fractured bedrock aquifer. We can build a simple AEM model to demonstrate that. We will start with a pumping well with no fracture, and then add the fracture to examine the result. In this model, flow is from west to east toward a pumping well. The well capture zone extends up gradient to the west, as indicated by the red path lines. We now introduce a transmissive line element running north to south and passing through the pumping well. The particular line element we are using here is what is called a fracture or drain element that provides a very thin linear transmissive element. If we plot heads along a north to south transect passing through the well, we can see that drawdown for the well pumping from the aquifer alone, shown on the left, is significantly greater than the drawdown from the same well pumping from the fault zone, shown on the right. Stated another way, the well on the right pumping from the fracture could produce a greater yield for a drawdown similar to that shown to the well on the left that is located in the body of the bedrock aquifer. So this was a very easy model to create to examine pumping from a fault. But a small problem occurs if we try to trace path lines from the well. We know that water is being fed to the well from the north-south fault, but the red flow path lines don't show that. That is because mathematically the drain element has no width. It does not actually represent a flow zone within the model through which flow paths can be traced. That is easily taken care of if we change the fault zone in the model from a line element to a long, narrow zone of high hydraulic conductivity, representing the transmissive flow zone created by the fault. Here the pathline pattern shows groundwater west of the well and fault entering the fault zone, forming a broad capture zone, and then flowing along the fault to the well. In fact, as shown in the zoomed-in view, individual flow paths and travel times can be analyzed by zooming in on the fault zone right around the well. And because AEM is a gridless technique, no additional grid refinement around the well and fault zone is required to do that. The same type of fault model can be set up in transient mode and used to analyze drawdown over time from a pumping test. The example I'm going to show is a model I developed to represent a large-scale pumping test near the Sandwich Fault Zone in northern Illinois, reported by Hadley and others in 2018. The map shows a section of the 85-mile-long fault zone that runs from northwest to southeast. The pumping test and model will focus on this approximately 12-mile section of the fault in the southeast area. The investigators constructed a MODFLOW model for the fault section and for the well field that extends approximately 2 miles east to west and 2 miles north to south, just south of the fault zone. The fault zone was set up in the MODFLOW model as having a lower permeability core, represented by the light blue cells, surrounded by a higher conductivity damage zone of fractured bedrock, represented by the darker blue cells. The following sequence of slides, taken from the investigators' figures, shows the transient drawdown around the well field as it is affected by the fault zone. This figure shows zero drawdown at time equals 0 at the start of the test. Slight drawdown after 5 days. At 10 days, the 20-foot drawdown contour just reaches the fault zone. After 15 days of pumping, the 20-foot drawdown contour has crossed the fault. 20 days, 25 days, 30 days, and at the end of the test, after 35 days, there is about 45 feet of drawdown north of the fault and 60 feet of drawdown south of the fault. That is, there is a 15-foot drop in head across the fault. Just as a demonstration, I set up a simple AEM box model with the wells in the proper locations and the fault zone represented by a combination of two elements to form a composite fault zone like the one in the MODFLOW model, with a lower permeability core surrounded by a rock damage zone. The core is a low permeability or leaky line element. The damage zone is formed by a long narrow zone of higher permeability. In the following sequence, I will show the results of the AEM model through time. You will see that they match very closely with the results of the MODFLOW model. We have zero drawdown at time equals 0, slight drawdown after 5 days. At 10 days, the 20-foot drawdown contour just reaches the fault zone. After 15 days of pumping, the 20-foot drawdown contour has crossed the fault. 20 days, 25 days, 30 days. At the end of the test, after 35 days, there is about 45 feet of drawdown north of the fault and 60 feet of drawdown south of the fault. That is, there's a 15-foot drop in head across the fault, just as there was in the MODFLOW model. This demonstrates that a simple AEM model can be developed quickly and easily to be used for planning an aquifer test like this, and possibly even for analyzing the test results. Next, I want to show an example of another fault flow situation. That is, the vertical flow of groundwater down a leaky fault caused by pumping from a lower aquifer unit. In 1990, Chao Shan was working on his dissertation, and as part of his research, he was developing an analytical model that accounted for this aquifer setting. A well, shown on the right, is pumping from a lower aquifer zone, which reduces heads in the pumped zone. This induces flow vertically down a fault, shown on the left, driven by the head difference between the higher head in the upper saturated zone, where head is assumed to remain constant, and the lower zone, where heads drop due to pumping. This diagram shows the heads around the pumping well for different fault conditions. If the fault zone is open and transmissive, sufficient flow down the fault will occur such that the head in the lower zone at the location of the fault remains unchanged, as though that location were a constant head boundary. If the fault zone is sealed, no vertical flow through the fault is provided in response to pumping, and the lower aquifer experiences essentially a Tice drawdown condition. If the fault is partially leaky, drawdown near the fault when the well is pumped will be somewhere in between. Dr. Shan derived this analytical solution. I could attempt to code that solution up in Excel or Python, but first, that would require a fair bit of work, and second, that would only provide me with a very simple tool to examine drawdown in the area around the well. It would not provide me with a model that I could use for pathline tracing or to add additional wells or additional faults. A better approach, given the tools we have available today, would be to develop a simple AEM model for this situation. What is needed to represent the fault is a linear element controlled by a reference head, that is, the water level in the upper zone, and which yields water through some resistance, the degree of sealing within the fault, when the well is pumped. That is exactly what an AEM river element does. I built a simple box model that consists of a single layer representing the lower pumped aquifer zone. I used well and fault location information from Dr. Shan's report, and I used the same aquifer properties and pumping rate. The well pumps at a constant rate. The river line element, with a reference head set to the water level in the overlying aquifer zone, is capable of releasing water into the aquifer as head is lowered in the pumped zone. When I set a high resistance to flow through the bed of the river element, representing a fully sealed fault, the fault does not provide any water from leakage. The resulting drawdown pattern essentially followed a Tice solution. When I set a low resistance to flow, representing a high leakage rate through an open fault, the resulting drawdown pattern showed no drawdown where water was entering the lower pumping zone along the fault from above. And when I set a medium resistance to flow, the model calculated moderate drawdown at the location of the fault. The results from the simple AEM box model matched almost exactly with the results of Dr. Shan's analytic equation, but it produced an actual flow model that could also be used for further analyses if desired. For example, the horizontal map of heads around the well and the fault from the AEM model, shown on the left, matched almost exactly with the Shan solution, shown on the right. And then in the AEM model, I could place other wells along the fault zone, balance pumping rates, perform pathline tracing, and other types of analyses. This last example model is meant to show how an AEM model can be turned on its side, in essence, to represent flow in a vertical aquifer cross-section. And specifically, I want to use that model to show how groundwater flow is affected by low permeability and high permeability fault features. This simple model represents a vertical slice of unit thickness through a fractured and faulted bedrock aquifer. The flow zone is 200 feet thick, and the model is set up with a larger depth dimension, i.e. a 5 times vertical exaggeration, for easier viewing of results. Groundwater is flowing from left to right toward an area beneath a house with a shallow water well. For this demonstration, we suppose that geologic investigations have shown the presence of certain planar features in the aquifer, including a steep vertical angle low permeability diabase dike, represented by a no-flow barrier line element, a horizontal zone of fracturing along bedding plane partings, represented by a long, narrow hydraulic conductivity heterogeneity, and a steeply dipping cross-cutting transmissive fault zone, also represented by a long, narrow hydraulic conductivity heterogeneity. Notice how the bedding plane heterogeneity and dipping fault zone heterogeneity have been joined to transmit flow between them. When we run the model and trace flow with path lines, we can see that flow is forced upward over the diabase dike, dives again and is drawn into the bedding plane parting zone, and then travels up along the dipping fault zone to the pumping well. This is just a simple example of how one can build geologic features representing fractures and faults into an AEM model to examine vertical flow paths. So given these examples, and many more that we could look at, I think the takeaway points are that AEM models are great tools for analyzing flow in fractured and faulted bedrock aquifers, and they lend themselves well to a stepwise modeling approach. For a copy of this presentation, and for much more information on building and applying analytic element models, visit our website at www.flexaem.com.